Hello and welcome to part 3 of the virtual tour of Bennington Battlefield. Today we'll be spending some time in a location that goes by many names. Simply the center is sort of more common, but you'll also hear this termed the Beardsley Farmstead, the River Flats, which can apply to sort of a more broad area, and then even sort of this surrender fields can describe a portion of our area of interest today. So it goes by many names, but essentially what we're dealing with is the eye of the storm. This is where, in all likelihood, the heaviest and most desperate fighting of the first engagement took place. This is also where victory was ultimately decided in the first engagement. So this is a position on the battlefield of monumental importance. Unfortunately, it also happens to be a position for which we have a relative dearth of primary accounts. So whereas on Hessian Hill or the Tory Fort, we have multiple eyewitness accounts in the forms of journals and retirement depositions and things like that. We don't have that same level of documentation for this location. So what that means is we end up relying fairly heavily on maps. And we are fortunate in that in the modern era, we have a couple German maps of this location that were not available previously to American historians. So, what are the implications of that? Well, if you read older histories of the Battle of Bennington, especially from the mid-19th century, but also even modern historians, some of these errors just get replicated down the years. But you'll read things about how Baum was positioned on the Hessian Hill. He was issuing orders to all his various forces from there. That he actually met Stark on Hessian Hill, and things like that. Which really, if you just sort of stop to think for a moment, don't make much sense. Aren't supported by a whole lot of logic. But then again, weren't also challenged by anyone or any sources, any primary sources. Here, however, we have a map of relatively strong reliability, whereas the Durnford map has been dissected in Phil Lord's War over Walloomsac. The Bach map hasn't yet received that same treatment. I can say, anecdotally, just from sort of playing around with different measurements, trying to convert archaic German units of measurement from, or converting from clafters to feet and things like that. It can get pretty hairy. The scale of this map doesn't really seem to correspond much with reality. And there's a good reason for that, why this might not be as reliable as Durnford. And that is because the man who drafted it, Lieutenant Johann Michael Bach, he was actually captured in the battle and severely injured. So he is captured, whether he's able to hang on to any of his, tools required for drafting these maps or any notes he makes from the ground, we really don't know. But this map itself seems to have been prepared later from memory. That is our best guess. But Bach is very reliable. He is reporting back to his, German potentate, kind of letting him know what all went wrong. And in doing so, obviously, he has, motivation to be accurate. but also, he has the means to provide, if not an accurate scale on this map, at least, relatively correct information, because he's actually, in all likelihood, positioned right here with Baum. So Lieutenant Bach, he was in command, overall command of the 2 3-pounders in the first engagement. When one of those guns was sent up to support the Dragoon breastworks, one presumes Bach remained behind at what could rightly be considered the main emplacement. He is, what evidence is there that this is sort of the main emplacement? Well, in addition to the 2 cannon both initially starting at this location, we also have a notation for a mobile smithy where the cannon were repaired. So it would seem to me that this is the more important of the 2 positions. This is probably where Bach would have remained, and from where he would have commanded. When the request for that support came, it probably fell to a subordinate to actually move the gun up the hill in support of the dragoons. So Bach is likely down here. He's getting the same view of the battlefield as Baum is, and he's got a lot of information that is not present on the Durnford map, and we will cover that. Now, additionally, and we're not going to be spending time on this, but Bach also covers the second engagement. Bach did not witness the second engagement. So, while it's a valuable resource for that, the accuracy of that may be open to debate or interpretation. We'll move on from, we want to dive into the map, but before we do, just one final word on the man who drafted it. After Bach's capture, apparently he felt immense trepidation for his future, as most prisoners of war do. But his was especially pronounced because he felt that he had been captured with foreigners. He considered the Brunswickers foreigners. He really didn't imagine that they'd be too keen on lending him hard money or, a spare shirt or anything like that, because they weren't Hessian. So it's a side note, but it's kind of an interesting side note, and it shows you some of the divisions that run through, a group that we sort of consider to be monolithic, German leased troops. We just kind of lump them all together, but in their minds, no, you don't lump us in. At any rate, let's remain on the hilltop here, or rather the shelf, and we'll sort of take things, rather than going strictly chronologically, we're going to take things location by location, point by point, because the thing to keep in mind with the first engagement is that it's all just unfolding basically at the same time. So, and that's all part of Stark's plan. So we've got, an envelopment maneuver being carried out on the hill and at the Tory Fort, pressing any Crown forces that escape. Where? Down the hill. At the Tory Fort, they flee everywhere, but presumably some loyalists who didn't, completely flee the field of battle would have had an opportunity to avail themselves of a river ford, possibly rejoining some of Baum's troops in the fields here. But really, basically, Stark's plan, we focus a lot on these wide marches and how amazing it was that the American Patriot Militia carried off these wide marches with, surprising precision for the 18th century. Um, that's only a part of it, though. Stark is also reading the terrain, um, and he's using it to his advantage. So basically, he is squeezing bomb into these fields. He's got a reserve force somewhere that he has kept. And it's not a true reserve, but that's again one of these labels that is stuck around. He's throwing everything in along with the kitchen sink in this first engagement. But basically when we say reserve, we mean the men not committed to attack either wing. He is going to press forward with them. So you've got Patriots probably chasing Tories across the river. You've got Patriots chasing Dragoons down the hill. And then you've got Stark's reserve pressing them where? Against the riverbank. This is basically the anvil, and Stark's reserve is the hammer. Once Baum is bottled up in here, and he fails to cut his way out, that's it. So these fields, this is where victory in the first engagement is going to be won. And that is, again, not an accident. This is all part of Stark's plans for the first engagement, um, coming off basically as perfect as you'd like. The second engagement, there's really not a lot of planning going into that. There's some close calls. There's a lot of luck involved. But in the first engagement, what we see here is basically, a successful series of envelopments, very intentional, planned by a seasoned military commander. Now, let's spend some time talking about the cannon. The cannon on the Bach map are a source of confusion for many. What do we see represented here? 1, 2, 3, at least 4 cannon pictograms. Why are there 4 if we only have 2 3-pounders in the first engagement? Well, basically what Bach is doing here is representing the same physical location at different points in time. So, whereas both cannon originally start on the shelf, one is moved here, and, interestingly, and you don't get this on Durnford, one is captured here after being repositioned. Very interesting. Now, when you consider the cannon pictogram, the longer part is the trail. So where it's actually facing is the shorter bit. That shorter bit is placed, obviously, facing some Patriot positions, but then, interestingly, facing these fields. Well, how can that be? Why would they be facing these fields when it's captured? One theory might be that Bach ordered a reposition in order to better cover the retreat of Baum's remnants. Again, just a theory, but very plausible that you actually had, for a brief period, some either some solid shot at greater distances or even some case shot being used against these positions. Ultimately, none of it matters. The artillery in the battle, obviously the Americans are going to be a little bit wary of that, at least for starters, but they end up doing something that militia was not supposed to be capable of. The cannon with Baum probably were a source of comfort to his detachment when they realize they're outnumbered. You know, well, at least we have the cannon to hold the rebels at arm's length. It doesn't work out that way in the battle at all. These men display immense personal bravery and are very ably led. So we actually have a quote from Bach himself. He says, quote, the Patriots, quote, did not even hesitate to rush within 8 paces of the cannon, loaded with grape shot. That is remarkable. um, Grape shot, or more accurately, case shot, was used in the battle here. That's going to be very effective at 8 paces, and very intimidating. But the Americans nevertheless managed to take both pieces of artillery. So quite the accomplishment. Now, let's move off the shelf. So we're going to come down, we're stepping away from Baum's tent, past the smithy, and now we're into some houses or structures here. Now, what exactly are we looking at? Are we looking at houses? Are we looking at barns? Is there any way to know? Well, traditionally, if you look at the Durnford map, he doesn't represent this as a smithy. It's just another structure. In all likelihood, this is the position of the Beardsley cabin. Currently, the position of the Barnett house. The Barnett house, if you visit, it's a big red brick slate roof house constructed, depending on who you ask, between the 1820s and 1840s. Probably on the footprint of the Beardsley cabin, but that's never really been confirmed. Now, why do we have other structures if that's the cabin? Well, you've got other agricultural structures, perhaps a barn in here, things of that nature. So these are not all houses. Some of these, or at least one of these, is going to be a barn. You're going to have other types of sort of outbuildings. So this traditional interpretation is that the Beardsley family is living here. There are some alternate hypotheses that actually no, the cannon could be one of these structures. But we'll stick with the traditional interpretation that the Beardsleys are right at the bridge here. So going back to Bach, we've got the Beardsleys. We've got their cabin basically requisitioned. Now, what must it be like to be a civilian on an active battlefield? The mind boggles. It's not something that we as Americans, thankfully, have had to deal with in our recent history. But we have these people confronted with a very difficult choice. You've got sort of dueling proclamations. On the one hand, Burgoyne is telling everyone, remain in place. Do not hide any of your, livestock or anything like that. If my army marches through, you'll be dealt with fairly. If you're not paid in hard coin, you'll get basically the equivalent of an IOU. The Americans counter that by saying, on the contrary, do not assist the Crown forces in any way. You will face consequences if you do, and if possible, you should, offer up resistance. So the Beardsleys are really caught between a rock and a hard place, and they have to decide on the best course of action for their family and their property. So not only are their lives potentially at stake, their property, which they've worked very hard. This is, as far as we know, the first wave of settlement on this specific area. In all likelihood, occurring sometime around the mid 1760s. So they've got some roots here, and they've got a lot of blood, sweat, and tears poured into this. And all of a sudden, this foreign army is marching across their property. And of course, they're greeted not by Baum, cutting a dashing figure on his mounted on horseback or anything like that. They're greeted by his vanguard, the men who actually lead his forces. And these are not necessarily people who have a lot of people skills to diffuse tensions. So I'm now going to turn to an account from the grandson of the family patriarch here. Levi Beardsley shares a family history with us. And it begins, quote, "The boys, when surprised and taken, were going to pasture after cows. The Indians would not permit them to escape, though they treated them with kindness, and whenever they attempted to turn out of the path, the Indians would press them in by putting their guns by their side, telling them, quote, not to strive. They were finally released by the interference of the Hessian officers a short time before the battle, and with the rest of the family were shut up in the house. After the main force had been called away from the house to man the works on the hill, a soldier came in and commenced pulling out the chinking between the cabin logs to enable him to fire out. My grandfather remonstrated or argued, and on the soldier persisting, the old man seized his musket, and being a strong man, wrenched it out of his hands and tossed it up into the chamber. That is the little chamber above the main dirt floor level of the cabin. Then, seizing him by the shoulders, put him out by main force and fastened the door against him." A fascinating account of, nonviolent resistance to these invaders, right? Well, okay, maybe that's how it went, and certainly we can understand how it would be a very appealing family history to preserve. Here is an eyewitness account from Wasmus. Quote, "We made our camp in the gardens of 2 houses here. The inhabitants had loaded 2 wagons full of furniture and put 6 ox into them. They were just about to depart and take flight into the wilderness. But now they had to unload, and our commander placed a guard in front of both houses so that nobody could take anything from them. They could safely remain there, for none of our men would take anything from them." So, is that directly contradictory to Levi Beardsley? Not necessarily, but it certainly paints a different picture. Rather than staying behind, steadfastly refusing to comply with the orders of these Germans, it seems as if the family's first plan, at least, was to get out of town, which is very understandable. So when we talk about the sons going out to pasture, well, we're probably talking about the baggage area here. They're probably trying to collect some livestock to depart with. When we talk about the gardens of the 2 houses, we might be talking about these structures here. So this is where, initially the Crown forces make their camp here. So again, another feather in the cap of this location, another interesting feature is coming out in these accounts. At any rate, basically the picture that emerges of the Beardsleys, is that of a family just trying to make the best of an intensely challenging and potentially dangerous situation. Now, let's go ahead and let's move on to another location. Now, specifically the fields. What do we have here? What is meant by all these N's and O's? Well, we've got the location where Baum is wounded, represented. And we've got the positions where his men were taken prisoner. This is a level of detail that we do not have on the Durnford map. Durnford doesn't bother to include this information, either because he didn't consider it relevant or because he simply was unaware of it. Perhaps he's taken prisoner in another position and is not part of this. But ultimately, when you're considering the Durnford map, the big difference here is that he is representing a single point in time. He is representing the instant before the battle takes place, rather than Bach, who's trying to basically do everything, with a single page. So that's one big difference. Now, what actually is going on here? Well, this is probably, we've mentioned drama frequently here. And if you want to talk about drama, this is really probably, the pinnacle of drama here. This is where Bach is shot through the abdomen, and that was likely while trying to cut his way through some of the forces that were standing in his way. He's running low on ammunition. He orders his men to hang their muskets up on their shoulders, draw their swords, and attempt to cut through. And apparently this comes to us secondhand from, presumably some of the few dragoons who actually come off the field, that Baum is actually successful at first. It's a series of charges that he makes, trying to literally cut his way through with the edge of his sword. But ultimately, it fails. Why does it fail? The Americans have the numbers. They have ammunition. Baum's men are out of ammunition at this point. The Americans are not at the same disadvantage. So, ordering a charge, that might be a way to, either a bayonet charge or a saber charge. Maybe that's a way to actually break a force that's sort of teetering on the edge. It is not not how you're going to free yourself from a trap like Stark has devised against a superior force. So, a very brave attempt to cut his way free, but ultimately fails. So Baum is going to lie on the field where he was wounded. His men, as you can see, you've got some indication that they continued to flee until they no longer could, until there's basically an obstacle in their path. They're taken prisoner. It is interesting to consider that as these men are being taken prisoner, as Baum is fatally wounded, they finally hear the sound of Bremen arriving to assist them. The reinforcements are here. About this time, about the time Baum is wounded and being carried off the field, they're here. They're not terribly far from the site of the first engagement. It's possible that, as Baum is being carried away in a cart, that he heard the sound of those 6-pounders firing. Perhaps he understood clearly that being gut shot, he would not last long, but maybe he's taking some consolation in the hope that Bremen will carry this thing off. And of course, for the Americans, jubilation ultimately turns to trepidation. These men consider how far they've had to march. They've had at least 60 to 90 minutes of heavy fighting, and weather that we presume is 80 or 90 some odd degrees, 100% humidity after a day of rain. They are physically exhausted. Some of them are going to pursue the stragglers who fled down the road right into the jaws of Bremen's force. But really, whereas you have sort of a series of clockwork maneuvers being carried off with precision in the first engagement, with the end of the first engagement and the beginning of the second, um, you have essentially a running battle that is, pure chaos, um, from the perspective of both commanders. Now, that's going to conclude the main action at this position. However, there is the day after to consider. Now, if we'll go back to Durnford, this is obviously an active farm. They're growing a variety of different crops that include potatoes. Potatoes are a staple food, especially over the winter. In the winter, you can go back to your stores of potatoes. It's a relatively stable food, especially if it's properly stored. Storing potatoes, one easy way to do that was via pit. So you would just dig a big hole and dump some potatoes in there. At the time of the battle, those pits were open, so they were not filled, they were not covered over, they were wide open. So when it came time for burials, and this really does prove the contention that this is an area of heavy, heavy fighting. When it came time to actually do, the cleanup of the battlefield, those pits are going to serve as mass graves. We don't know exactly how many were buried in there in total. There's some conflicting accounts as to the numbers, but most of the deaths, people killed in action in the first engagement here, are going to be buried in those pits. Now, we have a couple accounts as to how those pits were rediscovered. And it does get a little macabre, but there is there's a reason we share this account. So, bear with us. This comes to us from a account collected by Asa Fitch. This is an historian working in the early 19th century, gathering different firsthand accounts in preparation for a history. He's preparing for Washington County, and he's actually able to talk to veterans of the battle and civilians who observed it. He's really not going beyond secondhand accounts here, and certainly people who walk the battlefield in the early part of the 19th century still see the scars. It's possible at this time even you might have been able to see quite clearly the locations of the different breastworks that weren't yet repurposed or deteriorated. It really would be if you got in a time machine and it didn't have enough juice to make it back to 1777, 1812 or the 1820s, that would still be a fascinating time to visit the battlefield. But I digress. So this is an account from Asa Fitch, collected from a gentleman he identifies as Eldridge the Clock Cleaner. So if you needed your clock cleaned, you went to Eldridge. Quote, Barnett's brick house was built about 1822. And there's our Barnett house right here. When Eldridge was a boy, about 12 years old. In digging post holes for the front of the fence, they dug up 7 skulls and other bones of Hessian soldiers that had been killed in the battle. Barnett himself was gone to Hoosick at the time, and the man who had charge of getting those holes dug and the posts set was in great haste to get these skulls covered before Barnett got back, saying if he were there he would make them put these remains in a box and bury them in the yard of the Methodist church. So likely he's probably talking about, this is not a battle feature, but there's a graveyard further down Cottrell Road. Probably that's where these bodies would have been destined had Barnett been there that day. So really unfortunate that he wasn't, because then we'd actually have, a marked grave for some of these men. But we'll continue. Quote, Barnett himself had gone to Hoosick at the time, and the man who had charge of getting these holes dug and posts set was in great haste to get these skulls covered before Barnett got back, saying if he were there, he'd make them put the remains in a box and bury them in a yard in the Methodist church, which is a little east from there. Eldridge was holding the posts for this man to fill and tamp the dirt around them, and he would throw in a skull, and with the pounder, pound it down beside the post, saying that was the way he liked to treat the damned scoundrels that were coming to burn Bennington. The Indian chief that was killed on the east side of the river was also brought and buried near the same spot. End quote. So what we have here is, known as a battlefield burial of convenience. This is, not necessarily a proper grave. It's a mass grave. It's an easy place to intern bodies, and it's fascinating that decades, we're not at the century mark, maybe 50 years on, you still have people with a burning hatred for these the men under Baum's command. So much so that they were willing to desecrate their remains. So, that's really a sort of a fascinating tale, and it shows you, how some of the histories that these people were probably getting, still had a major emotional impact attached with them. So it's one thing for us to read 250 years on the accounts of these people and try and empathize and put ourselves in their shoes, but just one or two generations later, you still have some hot blood here. So just a fascinating account. That is going to do it for this installment. So we've completed, a few of the main portions of the battlefield now. All that remains is the Tory Fort, which will be tackled in a subsequent video. As always, if you have any questions, or if you'd like any additional detail on some of the accounts that we pepper in as we're going through our maps here, please don't hesitate to ask, either in the comments or directly. My name is David Pitlick. I can be reached at david.pitlyk@parks.ny.gov. As quarantine continues, we have plenty of time to answer your questions, so don't hesitate. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.